Sure. Thanks for having me. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to start by thanking the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment for the opportunity to be here today. Well, I'm sure most of you are familiar. The DZTE was established in memory of Daphne Zepos, a true cheese industry luminary, an importer, an educator, a tireless advocate for exceptional cheese. And each year, the foundation selects an industry professional to embark on a research project, traveling to Europe to share traditional cheesemaking knowledge with colleagues back here in the States. And for past recipients of the Daphne Zepos Teaching Award, this presentation has sort of represented the culmination of that travel and research experience. But as the 2020 recipient of the DZTA, COVID has really sort of hampered my plans, and I have yet to leave the country. And so my presentation today really serves as sort of a mile marker for an ongoing project, one on which I would love to sort of get your feedback as it continues to evolve. So I've spent the past year and a half or so researching via books and journal articles and via Zoom in conversation with some really lovely colleagues across the ocean. And in the coming months, I'm really looking forward to being able to get out in the world and hopefully connect with some of those folks in person. So the genesis for this research starts a handful of years ago for me during a sort of routine tasting of a hard aged cheese that I was making at that time. And I tasted two batches made just a week or two apart and very similar on paper, made from the milk of the same herd, nearly identical in moisture content and salt and pH. But one was really rich and flavorful with a texture that was kind of firm but yielding. The other was pale and waxy, and the flavor was kind of flat. Not bad per se, but definitely lacking. And I racked my brain trying to figure out where my cheese making had gone wrong. Being somewhat removed from the rhythms of the farm, it took me a couple days to realize that I was witnessing, over a year after the cheese had initially been made, I was witnessing the change from late summer grazing to indoor feeding of the herd's winter ration. And that sort of prompted me to realize that despite having spent years in the creamery making cheese, I knew relatively little about the factors that influence the quality and the character of the milk that I was working with on a daily basis. And this curiosity translated, I think, to sort of the basic question, like, what do cows eat, right? And some basic research led to the conclusion that cows today eat like any number of things, leading me to sort of I guess the obvious and maybe contentious follow-up, like, what should cows eat and why? And this probably isn't surprising, but what I found is that by exploring the traditions and the wisdom of some of our European counterparts, this sort of rough framework emerges, right, for what animal husbandry and for feeding systems in particular should look like in order to yield the best and most distinctive cheese. And I think, importantly, the same framework, when implemented thoughtfully and with care, allows for a dairy production system that is considerably lighter in its environmental impact than that system that's sort of more common and more conventional today. And in many instances, we can actually improve the health and the fertility of the working landscape via regenerative practices. So now, as we dive in a little bit, if someone asked me to summarize how to make the very best cheese, I would probably be hard pressed to give them a better answer than is found in this passage, which Patrick Rance wrote way back in 1991. And he writes, "These are the foundations of quality and natural local variety in cheese. Organically farmed permanent grassland grazed by traditional dairy breeds. In winter, hay, not silage, as food. Strict hygiene in milking parlor and dairy, exclusion of any milk given by cows under antibiotics or suspected mastitis. Traditional cheese making using raw milk and paying constant attention to acidity. Dr. Davis recommends locally made starters and for the best cheese of all, natural souring of the milk with no starter. This, I can promise you from rich experience, is the path to cheeses of incomparable aroma, flavor, and succulence. Now, for those unfamiliar with Patrick Rance, he was, yep.
1 second.
Yeah.
I believe your slideshow is not displaying right now.
Uh-oh, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Let's fight that together. How's that?
Beautiful.
Better?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Joel. So I've just read you this quote. I'll give you a moment to look it over, I guess. Thank you for saying something. Let's go right back here. There we are. Now, for those unfamiliar with Rance, he was an English cheesemonger and farmstead cheese advocate in the later part of the 20th century, and was, as far as I can tell, really like the first great writer about cheese, at least in the English language. And he has a couple terrific books of his own, but this comes from the foreword to a book called Cheeses of the World. And I became familiar with this particular passage thanks to Peter Dixon, who is a terrific cheesemaker, writer, and educator here in Vermont, who I'm sure many of you know or are familiar with. And I think one thing that has drawn both Peter and I to this particular quote is like a relentless optimism that the vision that Rance outlines here is achievable, although it's likely to take sort of decades, if not generations, to take shape and come to fruition. And here, Rance really manages to sort of encapsulate so many of the elements of producing a cheese that is not only delicious, but also one that really embodies the people, place, and animals involved in its creation, which he describes as this natural local variety, right? And I want to acknowledge quickly that past DZTA recipients Sam Frank and Tom Perry have done and shared considerable research on a couple of these elements, namely the use of traditional dairy breeds and the production of locally made starters, respectively. So in my presentation, I'm going to ignore those elements almost entirely, though I do think that they're enormously important for creating this cheese of natural local variety, who wants it. Instead, I am going to sort of highlight some of Rance's guidance around feed in particular, where he prescribes grazing one's animals on organically farmed permanent grassland and hay rather than silage as winter feed. Now, when I encountered this passage for the first time, it seemed to make sense and sort of jive naturally with my conception of what our dairy animals should eat. And having dug into this topic more, I appreciate why this prescribed system is sort of today the exception and not the norm. This vision that Rance presents is one of a complex system composed of like smaller complex systems. And putting these pieces together is immensely challenging. But that doesn't mean that it's superfluous or misguided. In fact, after doing this research, I believe as firmly as ever that following Rance's guidance to whatever extent we're able, and pursuing a diet of permanent, diverse pasture land while feeding high quality, locally grown dry hay in the winter is probably one of the most impactful decisions that we can make for the quality of our cheese and for the working landscape on which we depend. In my mind, it sort of shifts the conversation from my early questions around what do cows eat, or what should our animals eat, and instead it begins to sort of dance around a couple questions that have been itching at me for a while, and ones that I think as an American artisan cheese industry, we are going to have to wrestle with more and more in the coming years. And those are here. Firstly, I think it's imperative that we sort of ask ourselves how we create cheeses that are not just delicious, but can serve as the fullest possible representations of a complete farming system. And so if we accept the premise that every cheese is a sum of its parts and is influenced, for better or for worse, by decisions large and small, then it seems to me that harnessing the minutia in pursuit of cheese that is both distinct and delicious should be the ultimate goal. And as we'll cover in a little bit, sort of like thoughtful, regenerative, grass-based farming really can be the link, I think, between our products being sort of more consciously aligned with the farming context from which they emerge. And secondly, but as importantly, grass-based dairying presents sort of an opportunity to lessen our impact on the environment and even rebuild soil productivity and soil fertility by utilizing lessons from natural ecosystems and respecting our farming operations as these complex interwoven systems, rather than just like factory lines where we sort of like dial in a variable and tweak another variable here. Without sort of getting sort of too far down like a doom and gloom rabbit hole, a UN report has identified animal agriculture as, quote, one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global, and goes on to say that it should be a major policy focus when dealing with problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Wow. I imagine that we are all here today, at least in part, because we feel strongly about the future of animal agriculture and the promise that it holds. And in my mind, the link between how we feed our animals and their environmental impact provides us one of the greatest opportunities for improvement as an industry in the years to come. So to put it more simply, grass-based farming offers us an opportunity to make better cheese while simultaneously healing our land, or the opportunity to heal our land while making better cheese. And like the great thing here is that we don't have to choose and we don't have to prioritize one over the other. So with that in mind, let's sort of dig into the how, I guess. Very briefly, what is regenerative agriculture? In short, the term refers to a broad set of different farming practices intended to sink carbon or return more carbon to the soils than is being extracted from them. And in doing so, we build soil and build soil that's like more fertile and more productive. So animal agriculture provides us an important tool with which to do that. Cows, for example, can return an estimated 90 to 95% of the nutrients they consume to the landscape, while also indirectly sort of creating the conditions for additional carbon to be stored in the soil. So humans have been grazing animals for thousands of years and have recorded their best practices for hundreds of years, if not longer. So today, when we think about sort of like progressive conversations around grazing methodology, we often think about names like Alan Savory and a bunch of other sort of like gurus or experts who can be easily found on YouTube and the like. And I think, like, to be clear, I think like a lot of what Savory has to say makes a lot of sense. But I think it's also worth noting that that writers like the French dairy farmer Andre Lassagne and the British organic pioneer Frank Newman Turner, have been sharing advice with these like very similar themes for decades. So I guess I want to acknowledge that, in highlighting some of these key themes, I definitely run the risk of oversimplifying the work that like a skilled grazing dairy farmer, grassland manager does on a daily basis. And they'll sort of rely on these broad concepts that I'm about to introduce, but pair them with really intimate knowledge about the nutritional needs of their herd and of individual animals, knowledge of their specific farm or the land base that they're working, and they're constantly sort of weighing changing conditions throughout the growing season. So that said, I think these concepts are probably going to be sufficient For those of us who don't have to like head out to the pasture with a flock of cows, or I should say a herd of cows, a flock of sheep in the morning. Firstly, most grazing experts today advocate for what's known as a high stocking density, also known as mob stocking or mob grazing. And this means putting like a lot of animals on what seems like a relatively small paddock. And it'll look like fairly backwards to those of us who have been like raised on cute marketing images of like this handful of animals grazing quietly on this beautiful like green swath, right? The first time you see mob grazing in action, it just looks too crowded. But the idea here is that we want to create sort of the ideal balance of animals to grass, in essence, such that the herd grazes down the vast majority of plants in the paddock without circling back to regraze, because this regrazing is likely to further damage the plants and slow their rate of regrowth. So this regrazing or overgrazing is also generally less efficient than a herd's first pass through a paddock, just due to sort of the mechanics of trying to get a worthwhile mouthful of forage from a plant that's already been shortened. So particularly with a herd of milking cows, farmers are often really concerned about providing animals with sufficient dry matter to keep their milk production up, right? It's estimated that a dairy cow takes something on the order of 30,000 bites per day. And at that volume, even the sort of small inefficiencies caused by overgrazing can compound into a fairly significant loss of dry matter. And because of this, it's important to manage stocking density and paddock rotation to ensure that animals don't begin regrazing. So while grazing time per paddock can vary, Dr. Juan Alves here at the University of Vermont also strongly encourages farmers to move animals after no more than 3 days at maximum. 12 hours per paddock has actually become much more common, particularly amongst dairy farmers who milk twice a day, as most do, because this sort of provides the right rhythm. It means they can turn their milking herd out onto a fresh paddock after each milking. Now, closely related to this concept of rotating animals through paddocks in such a way that is responsive to the growth rate and the maturity of the plants in the paddock. So the idea is to maintain a healthy ecosystem that is capable of regenerating rather than slowly depleting like the productivity of the grassland, right? So ultimately, the fertility of the pasture should translate to greater productivity for the dairy operation. The grazing consultant and author Sarah Flack shared a quote in a recent lecture from a James Anderson. And back as early as 1797, James Anderson was sort of extolling the increases in production to be gained by dividing one's pasture into 15 or 20 different plots and rotating animals through them. So again, this information is important, but it's hardly new. This system of planned rotational grazing is sort of in contrast to two other methods of grazing: set stocking, in which animals are sort of turned out onto a single large pasture that they'll graze for much of the season, or strip grazing, in which animals are moved from one paddock to the next, to the next, to the next in sequence, without considering whether that paddock possesses sort of the most optimal conditions for that herd. So in contrast, planned rotational grazing requires that the farmer is constantly assessing the growth rate and the maturity of the plants in each paddock, and then picking the paddock that sort of is most suitable, I guess, is best suited for the herd to move to next. And Dr. Alves calls this the chess effect. I think it's kind of neat because it means that a farmer will graze paddocks on the opposite side of the farm if needed, and the paddocks in different stages of regrowth are often different shades of green, causing the grassland to look sort of like a chessboard from a distance or from above. And in addition to ensuring adequate nutrition for the animals, this sort of responsive rotational grazing based on close observation of the growth of pasture plants ensures that the plants have adequate time to grow and strengthen so that they're able to conserve energy and build their root mass underground. And this growth, though it sort of happens out of sight of us, is actually where sort of a lot of the regenerative, the regeneration, I should say, in regenerative agriculture takes place, right? It means that as pasture plants build larger, more complex root networks under the ground, they're helping to sort of pave the way for increased soil organic matter in the soil, which in turn improves the resilience and the regrowth rate of the pasture species, making a more productive pasture in the long run.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Could you hit refresh on your screen just to see if potentially the resolution might improve?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let me see if I can do that. Let's see. Any luck there, Joel?
About the same, but it's I think that's the best we're gonna get.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. Carry on.
All right. So, in essence, we're talking here about what sounds like, rightly so, a fair amount of work. And I guess, in the coming, the next little bit, I want to sort of build out the case that all of this trouble is worth all the additional effort in creating both better farms and better cheese. So the implementation of a regenerative grass-based system provides a number of opportunities to reduce a farm's dependence on fossil fuels. First and most directly, by grazing animals out on pasture, we bring them to their food rather than using a tractor or a skid steer to bring food to our animals. And similarly, animals on pasture fertilize the fields themselves, doing whatever they have to do wherever they happen to be. And this further reduces the fossil fuel load needed to haul manure from farm or barnyard. To be clear, in many parts of the US and Europe, and certainly, here where I live in northern Vermont, the grazing season lasts less than half the year. And at other times of the year, food and manure must be moved in and out of the barn. So there are limits to all good things. But it's certainly worth sort of seizing on the opportunity when it presents itself. On a very basic level, having plants of different heights and different sizes and shapes of leaves sort of helps to maximize sunlight capture, right? And so by having a really diverse makeup of plants in the pasture or in the hayfield, we can also make an ecosystem that's more resilient to keep us from the infiltration and damage from plant pathogens and pests. And the molds and pests that affect plant species are often highly species specific. So even if one plant variety in a given field falls prey to some type of pathogen or pest, there are plenty more in the field to sort of keep that space productive, whereas a monocrop would have been more susceptible to sort of total loss or broader destruction, right? And different plants contribute differently to the chemical and biological makeup of the ecosystem. Legumes such as field peas and clovers fix nitrogen, meaning that they, or sort of, I guess, more accurately, symbiotic bacteria on their roots absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available to the plants. And this nitrogen, which makes up approximately 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, is crucial for plants in order for them to undertake adequate photosynthesis. And notably, it's also free, which is terrific. So by using nitrogen-fixing legumes and other plants, we can sort of seize upon this atmospheric nitrogen rather than applying it via fossil fuels. Since the sort of the World War II era, it has become like conventional, if you will, farming practice to use commercial nitrogen fertilizers, which are generally produced from natural gas. And by incorporating a healthy mix of nitrogen fixing plants into our pastures, we can reduce that sort of reliance on fossil fuels. Right? So in addition to peas and clovers, alfalfa and vetch also fix nitrogen. And these are all sort of like common dietary components for dairy animals, including those used to produce some of our sort of our best loved European cheeses. Parmigiano Reggiano, Manchego rely pretty heavily on alfalfa and vetch, amongst others. So moreover, other sort of like favorite European cheeses are really leaning into this notion of plant diversity as a means of differentiation. Today, the Mondor AOP requires that 80% of a farm's grassland must be permanent pasture, as opposed to hay fields. And if these permanent pastures are going to be reseeded, meaning that more plants are going to be introduced via seed introduction, reseeding must contain no less than 5 species, at least 3 grasses and 2 legumes. So in this, in these AOP standards, we're sort of like codifying the need for plant diversity, both for the sort of the long-term health of the growing ecosystem and for the sensory characteristics of the cheese. Well-managed grazing systems with high stocking densities can also all but eliminate the need for chemical or mechanical weed control, sort of 2 of the main causes of human farmland degradation, right? Mechanical control by way of tilling the soil can promote soil compaction. And that's sort of like counterintuitive. Soil compaction can lead to erosion and the loss of soil organic matter and fertility, and ultimately, leads to decreased productivity. So this happens when soils are compacted to the extent that rainwater can no longer effectively penetrate the earth. And so the ability of the land to absorb rainwater is known as the water infiltration rate, and it's sort of a crucial tool by which we can store water to benefit plants and help them to better weather periods of drought. So when soils are compacted due to repeated tillage, rainfall instead pools on the surface of the ground rather than soaking into the ground and providing water to pasture grasses or other forages. Heavy rainfalls will then wash away any loose soils remaining on the surface, leaving the remaining soil sort of further compacted and dry, even while other areas of the same farm or the same town are experiencing flooding. So in short, we want to minimize or eliminate tillage in order to reduce soil compaction and allow for greater or increased water infiltration. I guess lastly, on this point, well-managed grazing systems can also eliminate the need for broad spectrum weed control chemicals, glyphosate. This is crucial to sort of the long-term health of the ecosystem, and particularly to its ability to regenerate and improve over time. Soil provides sort of far more than a physical architecture to hold pasture and hayfield plants upright. Bacteria in the soil live in an ongoing sort of symbiotic relationship with the plants. Plants release carbohydrates known as root exudates that feed the bacteria. And in exchange, these soil bacteria facilitate the transfer of trace minerals to the plant, adding resilience and increased nutritional density to the forages themselves. All that said, I imagine some of you guys are wondering whether I'm going to talk about plants all day or whether we might at some point talk about cheese. So we'll shift gears back a little bit and talk about the impact of grass and grass-based farming on cheese itself. in cheese making, we essentially transform fluid milk into like a concentrated, acidified, salted, semi-solid mass, right? And I've probably misspoken in some way, but I think that this definition is like probably accurate enough for our purposes. During the cheese making process, we remove some portion of the water, leaving us a cheese that's composed largely of water, any remaining water, I should say, fat, protein, minerals, all from the milk, and of course, any salt that we've added. And these key components of cheese, and fat and protein in particular, are impacted in some way by the diet of our dairy herd, right? The flavor and aroma of cheese are tied directly to the amount, the diversity of chemicals called volatile organic compounds, or VOC, found in the milk. And these VOCs are synthesized by the animal as amino acids are broken down in the rumen. So it's believed that cheeses produced from fresh forage exhibit more flavor intensity than those produced by conserved forages like hay or silage, because they provide the animal with a greater proportion of protein and therefore a greater proportion of amino acids that can be broken down by the rumen, right? Therefore translating to a greater volume of these volatile organic compounds. We'll see a couple results of a couple studies later on in which this sort of fresh forage has translated precisely to a greater intensity of flavor and aroma. One of the most significant ways in which we're able to influence our cheese milk is by influencing the balance of fats in that milk. And so the vast majority of fats in milk are triglycerides, meaning that they are composed of 3 fatty acids, shown there sort of on the horizontal squiggly lines, bonded to a glycerol molecule. And different types of fats are formed when different blends of fatty acids are synthesized by the animal. And this synthesis is driven primarily by the animal's diet. So grass-based diets are recognized to be higher in polyunsaturated fatty acids, as are some sort of like common feed concentrates, like sunflower and linseed cake. Meanwhile, other common feed concentrates that are commonly fed to dairy animals, coconut, palm oil cake, and often like the green tops of root vegetables. These are all higher in saturated fat. And this distinction between saturated and unsaturated fat is really important to our understanding of the link between feed and cheese, because each of these fats have very different melting points. So anyone who has a jar of coconut oil in their pantry is probably familiar with this idea, right? The melting point of coconut oil, the temperature at which it transforms from sort of this opaque, waxy solid state to a clear liquid state is about 78 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that while it's solid at room temperature throughout much of the year, it may become sort of a jar of almost clear liquid oil on sort of a particularly warm summer day, right? And so that transformation happens, that same transformation, I should say, happens in our milk fat and in our cheeses, right? So unsaturated fats, such as those synthesized when our dairy animals eat grass, is generally liquid or nearly liquid at room temperature, giving cheeses made from grass-fed milk a softer, creamier, more yielding texture. And this is what I was seeing in those sort of comparison of 2 cheeses side by side that I was talking about at the very beginning, right? All of the things being equal, that cheese made from grass-fed milk will be considerably softer, particularly when the cheese is allowed to sort of warm to room temperature before consumption, right? And the 4 most common fatty acids in milk are myristic, stearic, palmitic, and oleic. And the first 3 are all saturated, right? And so they're solid at room temperature. And that last, the oleic acid, is liquid. And that oleic acid generally represents somewhere between 30 and 40% of the fatty acids in an average milk sample. And as that percentage sort of creeps up towards 40%, through a diet, an animal diet, higher in grass, the body of the cheese made with that milk is going to be notably softer and generally is favored by consumers. And much has been made sort of in recent years of the health benefits associated with oleic and conjugated linoleic fatty acids. And so, both of which sort of appear, right, in higher proportions in the milk of grass-fed cows, meaning that these cheeses may hold like inherent appeal for consumers, particularly as consumers sort of trend towards these, the health benefits of grass-fed diets. One key exception to note is that a high proportion of these liquid fats can also cause cheeses to sweat excess fat quite easily, particularly when subjected to sort of a variable temperatures during storage. And so this sweating of fat on the surface of the cheese has been reported to be undesirable in some consumer focus group data. So the harder textured saturated fats, associated with a ruminant diet high in corn and some of those, green veggie top concentrates, definitely hold appeal for like the producer of fluid milk, right? As they offer like easy and affordable ways to boost the total milk fat level of fluid milk. And most dairy farmers today here in the US get paid, at least in part, on the total fat and protein content of their milk, rather than the specific makeup of that fat content. But from a cheese making standpoint, milk high in saturated fat can lead to cheese textures that are sort of like overly firm and waxy. And while there is sort of plenty of difference, I guess, between human and ruminant nutrition, the whole rumination thing being a big one, a few key similarities sort of stand out. Like us, ruminants need a diet containing ample energy, measuring calories, protein, fat, minerals, vitamins, and to some extent bulk, right? Generally in the form of fiber. And the balance of those elements is really key, just as it is for us. So on many farms, particularly here in the US, but certainly in the UK and elsewhere as well, corn silage has become a really significant dietary component for dairy ruminants, particularly cows, because it can provide sort of an ample source of calories and fiber in a cost-effective manner. Nick Millard, who's the herd manager at Westcombe Dairy in Somerset, pointed out to me that sort of our addiction, I guess, to corn is really rooted in its efficiency. You have a crop that stands like 7 or 8 feet tall, packs a ton of calories in its like carbohydrate-rich kernels, right? And lots of fiber in its stalk. So not only does a plant that stands 7 or 8 feet high give you like a really awesome harvest per acre, but it also helps to easily fulfill 2 of a dairy cow's sort of most pressing needs in the form of carbs and fiber. And that said, you'll notice that in Patrick Rance's guidance to us at the very beginning, he expressly prescribes hay and not silage as food. And we'll dig into some of the challenges, I guess, associated with corn silage from a cheese quality perspective in a little bit. But in contrast, a grass-based diet can provide sort of enormous benefits to the cheesemaker, but can provide, pose something of like a challenge from a dairy management perspective, as farmers, again, sort of grapple with providing their animals adequate nutritional density and caloric intake from grass and hay. So each day, a lactating dairy cow, goat, sheep can consume as much as 4% of its own body weight in dry matter, which we think of as the dry solids left behind if we were to factor out any water in the feed. And so for like 1,000-pound dairy cow, 4% of one's body weight translates to 25%, 25 pounds of dry matter per day. And providing the conditions for animals to eat enough on a grass-based diet can pose a real challenge. And again, this sort of goes back to the idea that we want to be moving our animals frequently between pastures that provide lots of fresh, healthy forages, rather than allowing them to regraze, which is sort of less efficient. I just want to clarify here that I frequently refer to a grass-based system, by which I mean the feeding of one's ruminants on a diet composed primarily of pasture and dry hay. But in practice, most of the practitioners, most of the farmers that I spoke with are feeding their animals some ration of cereals or grains to supplement and provide their animals with the energy necessary to help milk production at commercially viable levels, right? And while there are producers in both Europe and the US feeding their animals on like an exclusively grass and/or hay diet, it's far more common to find folks feeding a largely grass-based diet with some grain to supplement for energy. Okay. So though it sort of, I guess, runs counter to Patrick Rance's insistence on pasture and hay, I want to touch like ever so briefly on ways we can grow crops with the principles of regenerative agriculture in mind. And there are a couple really terrific books that cover this in depth. So I'm going to sort of breeze through it. I've compiled a list of resources that I particularly enjoyed while doing this research. And I'll ask Jewel and Tom and the gang to share all of those so you guys can enjoy as well. That said, I think there are sort of a few key concepts that we can go through now that will help align sort of crop production with a sort of a regenerative approach. The first is probably familiar to most folks. Cover cropping is the practice of covering any bare soil on the farm essentially as quickly and thoroughly as possible with a secondary round of plants after an initial crop has been harvested. And this helps to protect the soil from erosion and the loss of soil organic matter, while providing the opportunity to introduce additional nutrients to the land, right? And so sometimes a cover crop will be seeded into the soil really late in the season with only a few weeks of growing season left. And as little as like 3 inches of above ground growth or biomass can still translate to pretty sufficient underground biomass, root mass, to help anchor that soil in place through the off season. So when the frost finally kills off that cover crop, that root structure continues to anchor the soil, even as the cover crop begins to sort of decompose. And as it decomposes, it contributes vital carbon and nitrogen to the soil environment. And folks will choose cover crops, depending on sort of their relative nitrogen or carbon contribution to the cropland in an effort to replace nutrients that may have been stripped away by sort of the earlier cash crop. Yes. The second concept here is crop rotation. Again, pretty familiar to a lot of folks, but this is the practice of planting different species of plants on a given plot with each subsequent planting, right? And because different plants have different nutrient needs and make different contributions to the soil, crop rotation ensures that we don't deplete the soil of a particular nutrient without replacing it. And so this ensures that healthy soils can sort of persist over decades and generations. And this balance of nutrients can be managed in our permanent pastures and hay fields by ensuring that we have a makeup of diverse species, right? But in a monoculture crop production scenario, we need to use crop rotation as a tool to provide, that sort of adequate nutrient balance, I guess. For many conventional farmers, a rotation between two species, often a nitrogen-hungry crop like corn, and a nitrogen-fixing crop like soybeans has sort of become the norm. But today, a lot of experts are actually recommending rotations of up to 7 different crops over as many seasons in an effort to deter pests who may otherwise sort of adapt to like a traditional like 1-2, 1-2 conventional like soybean corn rotation. And then lastly, the use of no-till drills has really gained prominence as part of the discussion in the last several years, particularly for large crop producers. And these farming implements sort of look a lot like a modern plow to the untrained eye, which is say mine. But instead of like churning and overturning a field as a plow does, the no-till drill uses a disc to sort of like cut this little incision in the soil, drops in a seed, recovers that incision, and in doing so, and then repeats that many, many thousands of times. And in doing so, it can sort of reduce the disturbance of the soil and thereby prevent erosion by either wind or water down the road. Take a sip of water, if you'll forgive me. As we discussed sort of back at the beginning, there are many ways to feed a dairy animal. And while all have their pros and cons, the feeding of fermented feeds has become sort of the method of choice, I guess, for a large swath of today's dairy farmers for all the efficiency reasons that we discussed. And fermenting corn or grass or other forages with lactic acid bacteria helps to preserve that feed for future use. But if done poorly, it can also lead to proliferation of pathogens or spoilage organisms, like the species of the bacteria genus Clostridia, which can cause these sort of like unsightly gas pockets in our cheese, and cause like chunks of cheese to cleave off, and it causes this gas that sort of has a sort of foul smell to it. Needless to say, this is like not something you want to tangle with, really. So these microbes can be of particular challenge to raw milk cheesemakers, but while pasteurization will kill the pathogens, it isn't really a surefire way to kill all of the, or to rather to destroy Clostridia spores. And so, a high sort of Clostridia count can pose a problem even to makers of pasteurized cheese, which is just fairly problematic. And I guess, to be clear, I don't want to say that, I'm not suggesting, I guess, that one can't make great cheese from silage produced milk, and many folks do. However, it does sort of present a distinct set of challenges, I think, to the cheesemaker, and it's likely sort of particularly inappropriate, I guess, for cheese styles that are typically low in acid, or spend any sort of like significant length of time unsalted, as both acid production and salt help to mitigate these gas blowing issues. That said, more than simply like make a case against fermented feeds, I want to sort of make a case for grass and grazing, right? And today there's an ever-growing body of academic research that sort of seeks to better understand these relationships between feed and cheese sensory characteristics. So I've highlighted a couple favorites today, but if you're interested, the resource sheet I was talking about earlier that I put together includes a couple more, and I've found a couple dozen that I'm happy to point point you in the right direction if you want to sort of dive down this rabbit hole. So one of my favorites is a 2009 study conducted by researchers at INRA and the University of Turin, and compared the milk and cheese sensory properties expressed in an experimental Cantal style cheese. And essentially animals were divided into three groups, an otherwise homogeneous grazing herd. The first group I was kept indoors for the duration of the study and fed a diet of dry hay and corn and barley flakes and soybean cake. Group C was turned loose to sort of graze continuously over like this large plot of land. So again, like the set stocking method that we were talking about earlier. And then lastly, group R was rotationally grazed on a series of pastures that were immediately adjacent to that, the pasture, I guess, that group C was grazing. So the idea there, of course, being that we're implementing a rotational grazing system, but we don't want sort of the makeup, at least initially, of those pastures between group C and R to be fundamentally different. So made these small experimental Cantal style cheeses and then examined the differences between them. And not surprisingly, the cheeses made from both groups C and R exhibited sort of a greater yellow color than the group fed hay and concentrates indoors. Green grass possesses ample quantities of beta carotene, which is transferred to the milk and then ultimately to the cheese. So this beta carotene is degraded significantly when exposed to light. And so after hay is cut, meaning that while the milk from hay-fed animals sort of possesses many of the benefits of grass-based diets, as it relates to cheese texture, thinking back to sort of like the melting point of those fats, it won't exhibit the same rich color. And then as part of this experiment, there was a tasting panel that would review these cheeses and compare the cheeses from each group on a regular basis. And the tasting panel used for sensory analysis found no distinguishable difference between the two grazing system cheeses at 12 weeks of age. At 24 weeks of age, a higher percentage of panelists were able to correctly identify the two cheeses, but the margin of increase was like fairly slight, right? So in essence, at that 24-week mark, I think 44% of panelists were able to correctly identify which was from group C, the set stocking group, and which cheese was made with the milk of that rotationally grazed group R. And that's as opposed to about 35% of tasting panelists at 12 weeks of age. So that would suggest that the cheeses did become sort of increasingly distinct from one another as they aged. And I think the conclusion to be drawn here is that, at least in the context of this experiment, there was little sensory difference between the two grazing system cheeses, but noticeable difference between those cheeses and the cheeses produced with milk indoors using hay concentrates, right? And like any sort of academic work, this study, though I like it, is not without its limitations. It was conducted exclusively with Montbéliard cows, which are reasonably well adapted to an all-grass diet. As such, nothing but grass was fed to those two grazing groups, right? And still, I think it remains notable and maybe predictable, according to most contemporary grazing experts, that the rotationally grazed group would also exhibit a higher milk yield than the other two groups, which I think is really, really interesting and makes a great case for sort of the economic or financial viability of a strong, well exhibited, well implemented, I should say, rotational grazing system. In a similar study, which was produced just about a year ago, I think it was published in early March of last year, a team of researchers divided up a herd of Montbéliard and Holstein cows into 4 groups. Specifically, they had the same sort of groupings of Montbéliard and Holsteins in each of the 4 groups. Right? One of those groups they fed hay, 1 grass silage, 1 was kept indoors and fed freshly cut green grass, and the last group was allowed to graze outside on the pasture. And they then sort of assessed the sensory characteristics, again, of experimental cheeses made from the milk of these 4 production groups, as well as analyzing the properties of the milk and the milk production itself. And I think what they found, they sort of concluded here. I've broken down at the bottom of the slide there, but grazing resulted in cheeses with a stronger global flavor, meaning sort of a total intensity of flavor than all other cheeses. The barnyard flavor was more intense in cheeses from cows' fresh herbage than in cheeses made from cows fed conserved herbage. Cheeses from grazing cows had a more intense dry fruit flavor and weaker lactic odor than cheeses from hay and silage fed cows. Creamy texture was more pronounced when cows were grazing or were fed fresh herbage indoors instead of being fed conserved herbage. Now, in sort of like trying to square some of this academic work with the experience of real farmers and cheese producers, one recurring theme I heard from producers both in the US and in the UK, which has been sort of undergoing a fairly similar resurgence of artisan cheesemaking over the last couple of decades, is that the academic research can be useful as a means of like generating thoughts and ideas, but it rarely paints a really clear picture of how we implement a finding in a commercial dairy operation, right? Moreover, most academic studies last just a handful of months, maybe a couple of years at best. And so with this timeline, it can prove challenging to really draw conclusions about the impact of a particular change in diet on herd health, on productivity, or on soil health and productivity over the long term, right? And there's some sort of emerging studies that are aiming to capture this over a wider timescale, but by their very nature, we have to sort of be patient to see those quantified. Instead, most producers are sort of taking the academics with a grain of salt, so to speak, and they're more carefully watching their colleagues in traditional cheese-making systems in Europe, whether that's France or Italy, because these production systems, by which I mean like an integrated system of feed production, dairy farming, cheese-making, affinage, have developed over decades, if not centuries, and so they sort of provide better clues about what can work over the long term, right? That said, even the production systems sort of like most steeped in tradition and history, they also continue to evolve over time. And over the last couple of years, several of the AOP organizations, particularly those in France's French Comté region, have taken a closer look at how to use their authority over cheesemakers, or on behalf of cheesemakers, however you want to look at it, to limit the impact of their farms on the environment. They have increased the amount of pasture needed per animal or per hectare, and sort of like limited the amount of milk that can be produced per hectare, even as they sort of set a maximum distance in many instances of like 1.5 kilometers between pasture and milking parlor. So it's an attempt to keep the pasture immediately adjacent to where the cows are living and being milked. To be clear, these restrictions, if you want to think of them that way, on producers are not unanimously celebrated. They do limit the scale and therefore the income for individual farmers, but I think their intent is sound, which is to sort of secure a solid future for their respective cheeses by maintaining milk and therefore cheese quality and typicity, and sort of slowing or eliminating the degradation of the working landscape that's really necessary and inherent to those cheeses and their characteristics. Unlike many of the mountain cheeses of the French and Swiss Alps, where grazing fresh grass during warm months is sort of central to the production system, the cows used in the production of Parmigiano Reggiano are fed almost entirely indoors, though grass in the form of hay remains really the centerpiece of their diet. So the Parmigiano PDO restrictions stipulate that 75% of the forages fed to these animals must come from within the 5 provinces designated as the Parmigiano production zone, while the remainder can be sourced a little bit more broadly. And the 5th generation Parmigiano affineur, Giorgio Crivaro, which is a name that will be sort of familiar to a lot of American mongers in particular, insists that the cheeses he selects, which come from just 3 of I think it's 320, I think, Parmigiano producers, he insists that they be produced with 100% local forages. The cheeses he selects are also fed 70% hay and 30% grain, such as oats and barley, as opposed to a more common 60% hay and 40% grain split that much of the Parmigiano producers are embracing. And so his sort of experience and preference suggests that the cheeses produced with a higher percentage of 100% local forage are more representative of the agricultural context in which they're produced, right? He feels that they're more emblematic of the environment in which they're produced. I would say that by and large, the folks that I spoke with, most of them involved in some way in either farming, cheese production, or affinage abroad, were overwhelming advocates for grass-based systems, but they were also willing to acknowledge the challenges associated with them. And as we just discussed, the PDO restrictions for Parmigiano Reggiano require that at least 75% of the forage fed to the cows be grown locally. But many of the larger farms producing milk for Parmigiano will use a considerable amount of fertilizer. And they'll sort of push their croplands to produce 6 or 7 cuttings of dry hay because it's fed year round. And in contrast, sort of the smaller, more holistically managed farms using no fertilizer may expect just 3 cuttings of hay, or sometimes as little as 2 if they have a particularly dry season. And so, most of us, I imagine, are sort of familiar with the idea that the geographic or topographic challenges of a particular region and the solutions to those challenges are really deeply interwoven with the origin stories of our favorite traditional cheeses. Mountain cheeses typically require a really durable format, right? Sturdy enough to make a journey to market, if you will. And despite modern technology, many of these challenges related to topography continue to persist. In Spain, where alfalfa provides a food staple for many of the ruminants there. A farmer in the north of Spain might get 5 or 6 cuttings of alfalfa hay. Here, like in the winter in particular, the winter is fairly wet. Irrigation is fairly common, so you have this sort of persistent growing season. In contrast, in the southern province of La Mancha, where manchego is produced, not only is the winter significantly drier, but the water supply is commonly like 200 or 300 meters underground, and that makes wide-scale irrigation pretty impractical. So by contrast, they expect just 2 to 3 cuttings of that alfalfa hay. And these, I think these concerns may seem pretty remote to some of us, but there are plenty of challenges with grazing animals that apply to farmers sort of like regardless of where they operate, right? As mentioned previously, effective grazing requires that the grazier or the herdsperson to really closely observe both pasture conditions and the need of the herd or flock, and then adapt accordingly. Alan Savory's method of rotationally grazing animals, which we touched upon earlier, is often called management intensive grazing, because it requires such careful management and diligent observation. In addition to the skills and experience, though, the infrastructure can pose yet another major hurdle. Well-managed pasture can meet a herd's dietary needs. It's also crucial that a herdsperson considers the herd's need for water, protection from the elements, and their access to pasture, right? Like, how do they get there? So this access to pasture through purposefully built laneways allows animals to traipse from one pasture to the next, or between the milking site, the milking parlor, and the pasture without sort of doing undue harm, I guess, or eroding the soil, or getting excessively muddy, which sort of puts animals at risk for like a food safety risk, right? When milking. So Dr. Juan Alves, again, here at UVM, points out that the importance of properly siting our water troughs on pasture. The priority should be that animals don't have to travel very far to get water when they're outdoors, right? If they do, their manure and their urine is all going to be clustered sort of most densely around the watering area, rather than distributed, across the grazing area where we want it to be. And that means that the pasture is getting sort of unequally fertilized in its attempts to aid in the regrowth of that pasture. And then lastly, I think there's the important question of economic viability. And even those folks who are being really mindful of chemical and fossil fuel use, who are implementing a low input and low impact farming still continue to struggle with this, right? Writers and advocates, the rancher Gabe Brown, North Dakota is a great example of this, sort of profess that there's an economic transformation that regenerative grazing and cropland management has had for their operations. But the fact remains that dairy farming is rarely lucrative, right? All of the producers I spoke with who are intent on lessening their farming impact or regenerating the fertility of their working lands have either off-farm income or a highly diversified farming operation. So clearly, while regenerative agriculture offers promise for the future, it doesn't represent a financial panacea in the short run. And lastly, I think aside from the very tangible and practical challenges of producing somewhat less than one's sort of higher input counterparts, there can be some sort of more long-ranging challenges too. Namely these lower input grass farmers are frequently trying to balance the productivity that they need to keep afloat right now with the longer term goals of building the productivity of their farm for regenerative agriculture. So at Jasper Hill, where I spend most of my time, we're measuring increased productivity in our hay fields through natural fertility amendments like wood ash and compost. It was really, really exciting. But we're talking about increases in like single-digit percents year over year. So it's a really like long, slow game here. Perhaps most promising, as we've discussed, is like building soil fertility is something that we can do in tandem with our animals. So we may have goals for further improving our grasslands. We don't need to do so before they're put into use. So when managed correctly, having animals on the land is furthering both short and long-term goals, right? And while this is perhaps less true in Europe, where a healthy web of price subsidies has made dairy farming a little less like tenuous of a prospect than in many parts of the US. One theme that I've heard from cheesemaking colleagues in the US is how challenging it can be to find the right milk for your cheese business, or even the farmer willing to like discuss the farming practices that we as cheesemakers might propose. And so I guess as I wrap up, I want to like share a final piece of sage advice, you might say, from my friend Rachel Fritz Shaw, which is that as cheesemakers, whether we are farmstead producers or we buy in milk from nearby farms, we need to remember that it's not our place to teach the farmer their business. It's our job and responsibility to share with them our business. And by that, I mean, we need to help them understand our priorities and help them see clearly the ways in which our practices are sort of like inextricably linked from one another. So as Rachel told me, we have to be as interested in the repercussions of our ask on farmers as we expect them to be of us. Meaning that we can't expect the farmers that supply our cheese making to be interested in like the details or the intricacies of our work if we're not going to sort of like show them the same interest in the intricacies of theirs, right? And with this in mind, and having explored some of the like very real challenges and opportunities associated with a farming system that puts grazing at its center, I want to ask you to do like two things, right? One is to champion cheeses that are not only good, but good for the environment and the people and the animals involved. But secondly, I would also ask and encourage you to be patient. Whether you're a monger or a cheesemaker or you're the farmer yourself, feel at liberty to like acknowledge that the many challenges and considerations that impact grazing in any particular agricultural context, and recognize that a move to a lower input, lower impact, more regenerative farming practice is a journey more so than an endpoint. And encourage your friends and colleagues and partners to like explore that journey with you. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I see this presentation sort of more as a first step than a last step in the like wider arc of my project and research. And I think that the benefit of that is being able to sort of develop it with your interests and feedback and needs in mind. So as you explore this topic further, which I hope you will, please reach out and let me know where you could benefit from greater depth or insight. Thank you for joining me. Appreciate it. Joel, do you have some questions queued up?
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. So here you go. If you want to go ahead and actually stop screen sharing.
Sure.
So you can see, scroll up. Got a lot of fun things here. Sorry, so many good comments. Oh, great question here from Janet Fletcher. Does rotational grazing require more or less land per cow? I think it's such a great question when you're trying to convince people or make the argument for it.
Likely it requires more, I would say, though not dramatically so.
Gotcha. All right. And if anyone has any things bouncing back after that, definitely feel free to pipe in on the chat. And we might, guys, at some point do a raise hand feature, depending on how many questions we have, if you want to actually speak directly with Matt, but I want to get to these ones in the chat first. Okay, here's another one from Brian Wasick. Would farmers or cheesemakers plant or encourage certain kinds of pasture more for milk character or pasture health?
Would they or should they? I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
Would they? Yeah, is how the question is framed.
Not being a farmer myself, Brian, my inclination is that you probably don't need to choose, though if you did, I would say that, herd health seems like sort of the wise priority for the long-term success of one's business, I guess.
Yeah, and probably kind of a lot of what you saw was different things grow well in certain areas, right? So
that's right.
Be taken into consideration, right?
Yep.
That probably help. That all might work together, right? Serve the cow well, or animal well. So here's another Janet Fletcher. Idea of natural souring of milk with no starter. Is that legal in the US? Would dairy inspectors consider that a safe practice?
I would say that it is legal in the US, but most that would be a leap for many dairy inspectors in the US, and would require sort of like ample validation of one's methods.
What kind your experience, I mean, I don't know if you've ever worked personally with natural souring of milk, but what kind of things do you think that would mean that you'd have to kind of bring to your inspector then?
I think that there's a way to build out an in-house validation study as a cheesemaker that demonstrates sort of like the preference or the pressure to grow a healthy like lactic acid bacteria environment in your milk. So in sort of this natural souring of milk, we're really hoping to create the conditions to foster the lactic acid bacteria native to that milk. Of course, relative to a coliform or something that presumably could also be present there. And so I think if you could demonstrate that you were able to do so robustly and reliably, there's probably a large data set necessary to convince one's dairy inspector, but it's not undoable.
Cool. And then here's a question. Are there many American cheesemakers that are focusing on restoring native grasses and flora for their dairy animals to pasture on, as opposed to non-native old world grasses that were introduced by ranchers? Great question.
Yep. So I would say that, the benefits of native prairie grasses, of course, are that they are native and are theoretically well adapted for the environment in which they're growing. So the interesting thing about doing this research as it pertains to the US is that a lot of the research on grass feeding and pasture management is geared towards beef producers and not dairy producers. Much of it is done on the plains and in the western part of the country. And the reality is, I talked a lot here about sort of meeting the nutritional needs of a lactating dairy cow. And the reality is that meeting the nutritional needs of a beef cow is significantly less. And so in doing this research, I've sort of struggled at times to separate like the learnings of regenerative beef ranchers and their endeavors with like native prairie grass from the realities of a commercial dairy operation, which is tough. So to speak precisely to dairy farmers doing this in the U.S. right now, I'm sure that it is happening, but I think a lot of that work is actually being done in the grass-fed beef industry.
Be interesting again as part of kind of as your research always is a continuing thing, right? This might spark some conversations, which who knows where who knows what will be in 5 years if someone would ask that question, right? That'd be really, really cool. Some great comments. Everybody's loving it. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, cool. So we have a question here. Cost of end product. When the cheese reaches the counter, is it a feasible selling price? So I guess wrapping in all of your wonderful, idyllic concepts. Yeah. How would that actually impact end price?
There are a lot of factors in play when it comes to end price, and doing this in the U.S. certainly is not without challenges. I would say that on the face of it, Comte is probably the greatest model for this, and I think exists on most of the cheese counters in this country, right? So certainly it can be done. Can it be done well and sustainably in the U.S.? Yes, but these cheeses aren't cheap, right? We've sort of talked before about one of the best examples of this in the U.S. probably being Uplands and their work, developing and sort of honing their grasslands in benefit of Pleasant Ridge, and it's a remarkable cheese, but it's not cheap, right? So there's a value associated with that work for sure, that needs to be passed along to the consumer in an effort to make it a sustainable thing in the long run. But I mean, I think we can all agree that that's an immensely enduring contribution to the artisan American cheese canon, right?
Yeah, I think a good way to look at that too is I just want to pop in for a second, this awkward voice just in the background. But yeah, I think to your point is, when you look at Comte, you have kind of a universal thing too, right? All Comtes are competing in the same market because they all have the same standards when it comes to pasturing, right? So the prices are all pretty equal in that sense, right? Because they're all operating in that same level of standard when it comes to pasture care. When you're looking at something like Manchego, where it could be really stark contrast in pasture care. Yeah, if you're trying to convert a huge factory Manchego to all of a sudden that's going to have a huge probably price increase. But I guess the question would really be, where are we starting from as far as where the price changes? Are we already kind of almost there, but we're just changing this one thing? Might not have that big of a price jump, but yeah, starting with something hugely commodity, just with feed coming from another country, even probably a huge jump. But
I think that the Crevero Parmigiano thing is a great example of this within a widely recognizable brand, if you will, right? We don't have terribly robust grocery options where I live out here, but I can buy a passable chunk of Parmigiano Reggiano at my local co-op. Is it the best? Probably not, right? And it's sort of to the earlier point, I guess it's probably, even if it is delicious, it's probably not the most representative example of its agricultural context, right? Of the farming system from which it comes, right? Again, this is, if we require that 75% of the forage used in Parmigiano comes from the production zone, that means that the other 25% can come from somewhere else, right? So where we don't know.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So many stimulating conversations to be had, right? Another great question is from Zachary. Over the course of your research, did anything stand out as something you didn't expect or changed a prior thought you had going in?
Yeah, totally. And I think, as a cheesemaker and as a mild control freak, I was sort of looking for sort of a direct, like, add this, receive this, like, transactional approach to, add more alfalfa and get this flavor in your cheese. And, to some extent that work is being done. I actually found it less, like, compelling, I guess, when I began to, like, dig into those journal articles, than to sort of look at a more holistic, like, what are all of the parts that need to be, like, summed, in order to yield a cheese that we actually enjoy, right? And so I think that, what was perhaps, the most interesting part of my journey, with all this, is that I developed sort of an appreciation, a greater appreciation perhaps, for the nuance, and uniqueness of a farming system, as opposed to sort of taking, like, a cheese engineering approach, to a given product, right?
Yeah, there is science, but there's also kind of art to it, right?
For sure.
Yeah, always fascinating. I like when there's surprises along all of your journeys. That's great. Question here from Karen. I have a small goat dairy cheese making operation in Humboldt County, Northern California. We practice rotational grazing and have been seeding the pastures with native grasses and legumes, as well as feeding local grass hay in the pastures to add those seeds as well. Goats live on pasture, have access to local alfalfa hay at night, and get a small amount of organic grain mix on the milk stand. Thanks for your research. Very interesting information presented. So we do have somebody to answer someone's question. Are there people actually introducing some very selective
Karen, I think that's awesome. And if you have the time and want to talk more about that at some point, my email address is matt@jasperhillfarm.com, and I would love to hear more about the work that you're doing out there, because it sounds terrific.
At jasperhillfarm.com. I dropped in the chat for everybody, but great, awesome conversations, love it. There's just some feedback. Okay, here, just a comment from Laura Downey, Fairfield Cheese. It's a constant battle to tell this story to the consumer, but it can be done. I think if this type of end product is to flourish, it is all about education. It's certainly a challenge in the United States. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on, because this is obviously like a clearly kind of, master's level presentation. You're not going to have your average Saturday afternoon customer probably sit and listen to this. If they do, that's awesome. We all would love these.
We all need more customers like that.
Please find those customers. But yeah, do you have any, like, how do you think you could, like, in a monger pitch, start to incorporate more of these conversations about the importance of pasture?
Sure. I worked briefly as a cheesemonger. I was never very good at it, and that's why I took up making cheese. So forgive me if I sort of come up short, but not being very good at sales, my basic inclination is that in selling things, we want to understand what is important to our customer, right? And I think that one of the important things about this work is that there are relatively substantial evidence of healthier products in regards to like greater percentages of polyunsaturated fats, right? There's certainly an element of environmental stewardship, and some of this cheese, if we sort of rewind to the beginning of the presentation and my comparative tasting, I think that, like, in about as controlled an environment as I could create by accident as a cheesemaker, the cheese produced from a grazing environment was just plain better. And so I think whether folks are concerned about their own health or the health of the environment, or just want some damn good cheese, there are benefits to this system for all three. And it's, I think the question is, like, how quickly as a cheesemonger can you ascertain the priorities of your customer, or like telegraph onto them the priorities that are really like at the forefront of your mind on a given day, And I think that we all, if I learned anything in cheesemongering, it's that like the things that I was most excited about were the things that sold the best on a given weekend, right? And to this day, like when I go to a cheese shop, I want whatever's really exciting the monger that day, right? And so I think that to some extent, it's about trying to figure out how quickly you can understand what your customer wants. And to some extent, it's about bringing your own like enthusiasm for that thing that day, and getting them just as jazzed about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had a moment, it's so funny you say that. I had a moment speaking to friends on Friday, and they asked me a simple question, and the answer they got was not what they think they were expecting. But I got really nerdy, and I got really deep into talking about just like rumination, literally. Like, I don't think they were expecting it at all on a Friday. But clearly I was very excited about it, and just like kind of babbling almost, but yeah, it was coherent, and I was trying so hard to like help them understand this concept and how cool rumination is, basically helping humans eat grass, right? Like we can do it all, right? It's just super cool and all these things. And at the end of it, I found myself a little self-conscious. So I was like, oh, wow, like I nerded out real hard. And you asked for a really simple, like, you thought it'd be a fun pop question to like a group of friends. But what was interesting was and I kind of found myself a little apologizing. I was like, oh gosh, like, don't ask me another question later, guys. Like, and they're like, no, that was really fascinating. Like, I kind of don't totally understand all of it, but like, that was really cool, actually, And so I think, yeah, we underestimate sometimes our own passion can really be infectious, right? And maybe they don't 100% get it in that moment, but like they'll get it eventually, right? It's that power of belief in your customer that they can come on board these kinds of things. Yeah. But also your great idea of like the asking questions, trying to ascertain, what are their priorities. That's a great tool.
I think my takeaway there is that you're clearly in sales for a reason and I'm clearly not. And the difference between us is that my friends long ago stopped asking me questions about cheese. They know better now.
That's all right. That's why we got you a scholarship.
Thank goodness. There's someone to talk
about it, and people care. They're so excited. That's great. Next question then. Would you then say that grasses native to North America do not meet or are not well suited to meeting the nutritional needs of dairy animals, considering that dairy animals are non-native?
That's a super interesting question.
Super interesting.
And I'll be like quite frank. That was not like a pun that I intended to make, but Sam Frank is really sort of like the much more an expert on the breed specificity than I am. I think to answer your question as well as I can, we have found that dairy animals can do quite well. Again, sort of rewind all the way back on a very broad swath of different feeds. And when I, suggest that corn silage is like not the appropriate feed for making excellent cheese, I'm not really even convinced that it's not a sensible feed for some dairy farmers in some contexts making some products, right? It's probably quite certainly not the right thing for makers of raw milk, low acid brined alpine cheese for a whole bunch of reasons. But it very well is like the right answer for producers of fluid milk in many, many parts of this country, right? Again, that's completely ignoring like the environmental degradation aspect, right? If we're looking purely at like what can cows eat and produce milk that meets our sort of needs as consumers, the possibilities are like seemingly endless. And so I think that my research is really focused on like how do we create the milk that best meets our needs as cheesemakers hoping to make like really distinctive cheeses. So in summary, most grasses, many throughout the country will sort of be well suited to your dairy farming context, despite ruminants, those ruminants not being native.
Again, all about what goals and priorities are, right? And this ties in well just the next comment, because it's that concept of terroir is a taste of place, but what is that place? It's not just the land, it's also the people, right? It's the resources available to them, it's the techniques, things like that. And so that's kind of what the point you're making is, this cheesemaker's decision to put a stamp on their cheese, and what can our property, our land, our people, our culture give from here. Sure. Those decisions that you make too, right? They're all
I think that's a very cool point.
So about our humble cheesemaker, she says that it's great. Her stuff reflects the farm, which I'm sure it does. If you're using native grasses, that's awesome in Northern California. All right, pasteurization question. So how does pasteurization affect the final quality of the milk working with these models of native grasses and natural grazing? So how's it impacting flavor?
So there are multiple things that contribute to the flavor of cheese, right? And some of them are chemical and some of them are microbiological. And I think one of the interesting things from some perspective is that cheese that I was making that demonstrated like a greater intensity of flavor, produced from grazed milk, as opposed to a much lesser intensity of flavor from sort of like a TMR winter ration, was a pasteurized milk cheese made with some commercial starter cultures and an identical sort of like a cocktail thereof. And so would that cheese be more interesting had it been raw milk? Very likely. I guess my point is that there were distinct like biochemical differences in that milk that made those cheeses quite distinct from one another. And I think that sort of the introduction of native flora and a raw milk cheese would probably have furthered those differences, and would undoubtedly have given sort of like a additional character probably to both of them. For better or for worse. But I guess my point is that, I'm a huge advocate for making raw milk cheese where the opportunity presents itself. But at the same time, there are meaningful differences to be had by, sort of a grass-based system for pasteurized milk cheeses as well.
Brilliant. Yeah. All right, so far that's all the questions we have. Thank you to that question answer, the person who posted it. If anyone has any other questions or even would like to just speak directly with Matt, feel free to raise a hand, Zoom hand, little blue hand, each color, or throw into the chat. If not, we know it's definitely a little late, especially here on the East Coast. But in the meantime, if anyone has any questions, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. On behalf of the DZTE, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Wonderful to see actually the journey of this presentation, having seen just the different draft versions and then the presentation at the American Cheese Society conference this last summer, and then now where it's gone, and even just how your thoughts still, pardon the pun, ruminates over time. It's been a theme the last week, sorry guys. But it's really, really awesome to see, and I just can't wait to see how this continues to grow, especially now that we had this opportunity to like really discuss it with people and see where those conversations go. I think it's gonna be really, really great. So on that note, doesn't look like anyone has any questions. So last little bit of housekeeping, just or more announcements than anything. Thank you everybody who came tonight, really, really appreciate it. Your donation and your ticket just were launched a second scholarship. Matt was kind of unofficially like the first recipient of the Daphne Zepos Research Award because he wasn't able to travel. However, we have hopes he will. We're positive thinkers, right? You got the full award. But yeah, so we have 2 scholarships that are currently available for anyone who wants to apply. You can look find the applications on dzte.org. So Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment.org. And the applications are there. So the two key differences, we have the DZTA, which is the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment Award. Wow, I knew these acronyms were going to trip me up. That's the award that Matt won and received. So that's the one that historically you guys have seen. Anne Campbell went to Egypt and Greece. We know many have gone to France. Tom Perry went to England to study starter cultures, all these different things. So that award specifically, that is for travel and coming back and teaching at the American Cheese Society Conference in 2023 and beyond. But that's kind of the little crib sheet notes about it. That application is due May 31st. But the research award, which does, it's for $5,500. The research award, which does not require any travel, can be just conducted at home or wherever you need to. And
very convenient when there's a global pandemic.
Yes, they can be done during a pandemic. Matt is living proof. And we have our other recipient, Mary Casella. She was our first recipient last year. So that's a $2,500 scholarship where you conduct research. Again, both of these scholarships, you can build your own curriculum. So you get to choose. So we don't have a list of things that you have to research and choose from to then pitch to us as a board for a review. And with that one, there's a little bit more flexibility on what kind of fruits of your labor come out. It doesn't have to be a presentation like this. It can be some sort of like media project or some sort of written project, book, whatever it may be. That's up to you to dream about. And that's a $2,500 scholarship. That deadline is May 1st, a little bit sooner than the other one. So all this information is on our website. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to info@dzta.org. And we have also contacts of people you can talk to. So Matt is one of those. He's a past recipient. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll put you in touch with different people in the organization, greater past board members even. If you have any questions about your vision or just want to run an idea past somebody, you cannot talk to the board directly because they're grading yours. A little bit of conflict of interest for them to see your vision in advance, but we have this great wealth of a network of people who are very closely connected to the organization and can give you great advice. So I look forward to hearing from everybody, but yeah, your donation tonight, we really appreciate it. Helps make sure that we can keep funding these scholarships, especially during difficult times. Financial situations all change. We're able to adjust the scholarships for inflation costs to raise those and offer more and more scholarships, potentially give more and more out. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining tonight. And thank you, Matt, for staying up late.
Thank you.
And presenting, did a great job, really, really engaging. So thank you, everybody. And as a heads up, I don't have a date for when this will be on our website. So just patience. We're in the middle of, it's not going to be just like the Zoom recording. We're actually trying to make like a nice video that will have like Matt's slides in there and things like that. So it'll take a little bit longer than just putting MP4 up on the internet. So, but I'm hoping in the next month or so, it'll be up on our website. So you can follow our social media to find out when that is. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, guys. Be in touch.
Bye.